Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Billionaire father sees black waiter feed his disabled son, and it changes his life forever. In a luxury restaurant perched atop a New York skyscraper, where panoramic windows offered a breathtaking view of the glittering lights of Manhattan, refinement reached new heights. The Italian marble floor gleamed under the dim lighting of crystal chandeliers. The immaculate white tablecloths, silver cutlery, and champagne glasses seemed part of a secret ritual, reserved for an elite who had forgotten the value of silence and the pain of the ordinary. The waiters, dressed in black and white like invisible pawns on a golden chessboard, moved with the discretion of well-trained shadows, sketching precise, almost choreographic gestures. That evening, at exactly 8:02 p.m., a man entered. Alexander Whitmore. Real estate magnate. A name spoken in the glass towers of Wall Street with a mixture of respect and fear. At 52, his fortune shook the markets, but his gaze drove away emotion. His perfectly tailored, dark charcoal Armani suit barely concealed the armor he wore at all times, a clinical coldness, a calculated restraint, and a quiet disdain for anything that wasn't productive or profitable. But that evening, something stood out in his perfectly polished picture: he was not alone. Beside him, in a state-of-the-art electric wheelchair, was Ethan, his 13-year-old son. A small, fragile, thin body, almost lost in the leather of the seat. His lively gaze was trapped in a body frozen by illness. He didn't speak. He didn't eat alone. He expressed everything through his eyes, but few still knew how to read them. Since the tragic death of Ethan's mother, Grace, taken 2 years earlier by a fulminating cancer, Alexander had disappeared behind his files, his buildings, his acquisitions. He had traded tenderness for diaries, parenthood for monthly checks and specialized medical teams. He wasn't cruel. He was absent. Emotionally drained. But that evening, at the insistence of a therapist, and perhaps, deep down, out of a pang of guilt he'd never dared to name, Alexander had agreed to dinner. A father-son dinner. Without a caregiver. Without an assistant. Without a screen to distract him. Just him and this child whose tastes he barely knew, whose silence he feared, whose involuntary movements intimidated him more than any board of directors. They were seated at a table near the large bay windows. The city shone beneath their feet like an ocean of stars. Ethan let out a soft, almost imperceptible cry at the sight of the yellow taxis so small, so far away, below. Alexander attempted a smile, awkwardly. He didn't even know how to react. His own son seemed to belong to a parallel world. He sat down, back straight, hands crossed. He had nothing to talk about. He had never learned how to make conversation with his son. He loved him, yes. He would have given his life for him. But he no longer knew how to be a father. Before them, 2 glasses of water were poured. The crystal clinked softly. And for a few minutes, only the discreet rustling of distant conversations and the setting of china filled the table. The silence was heavy. Suffocating. Alexander glanced at his son. Ethan was looking at him. Intensely. As if waiting. As if wanting him to dare. But Alexander didn't know where to start. The server assigned to their table was named Jamal Brooks. 34 years old, slender, with warm brown skin and a serene face. He wore the black and white uniform with dignity, but there was nothing submissive about his demeanor. Calm, poised, attentive to everything without being intrusive, he moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who refuses to disturb fragile things. Jamal wasn't like the others. Where most of the restaurant servers treated customers with polite automatism, a standard smile plastered on their faces, Jamal radiated something else. Something deeper, almost invisible to the hurried eye. A form of real presence. A silent respect, a way of being there without imposing. And above all, that look. The look of those who have known pain without ever letting it consume them. The look of those who understand suffering, without needing to be described. Before becoming a waiter, Jamal had been a pediatric nurse. For nearly 10 years, he had cared for children with severe disabilities, held trembling hands, and learned the skills of care, empathy, and listening. But when his mother suffered a debilitating stroke, he had to abandon his vocation to become the silent pillar of his own family. The restaurant position allowed him to stay close to her, while maintaining a connection, however tenuous, with serving others. That evening, when he received the order to take charge of table 17, he immediately noticed the wheelchair, the father's tense attitude, and above all, Ethan's gaze. He approached with measured, respectful slowness. His tray perfectly balanced against his left arm, he leaned in slightly, but not too far, not condescendingly, and looked directly at Ethan. Then, with a sincere smile, full of light, he said, "Good evening, young man. I'm Jamal. You're my special guest tonight, okay?" Ethan, surprised, opened his eyes wide. A clap, a small cry, a burst of almost suppressed laughter escaped him. It wasn't a reflex. It was a response. A recognition. Alexander, across the table, raised an eyebrow. He'd expected the waiter, like everyone else, to speak to him, the middleman, the only one capable of understanding, according to social norms. But no. Jamal hadn't even looked at his suit or his gold cufflinks. He'd seen the child. And this simple gesture, as natural as a hello, had already changed the emotional temperature around the table. Jamal continued, still facing Ethan, but this time gently. "Do you want me to tell you what's on the menu? There's pasta dancing in tomato sauce and fish that swam right onto your plate. Which one do you choose?" Ethan waved his arms and let out a short, happy laugh. Alexander, on the other hand, was frozen. It wasn't anger. Nor jealousy. It was astonishment. A mild but profound shock. Jamal wasn't there to flatter the billionaire father. He was simply there for the son. As if Ethan were a human being in his own right, not a secondary figure in the shadow of a famous father. Jamal then glanced at Alexander. Peaceful, respectful, but frank. "I'll take care of you both tonight, sir. If you need anything, just let me know." Alexander simply nodded. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't in control, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. When the dish arrived, a perfectly seared salmon fillet with truffled mashed potatoes, the vapors rose slowly into the air, like a silent offering. The waiter delicately placed the plate in front of Ethan, then Alexander, and slipped away without a word, as was protocol. He looked away. As if he were unworthy of this moment. As if he no longer belonged at this table. For 10 long minutes, Jamal was the only living link between this frozen father and this radiant son. And when he had finished, as discreetly as he had come, he stood up. He didn't try to linger. He didn't wait for thanks. He took a small folded piece of paper from his pocket, placed it near Alexander's glass of water, and then walked away in silence. Alexander stood there frozen. He hesitated. Then slowly took the paper. A simple note, handwritten in neat, straight handwriting. It read, "Your son is extraordinary. He lacks nothing, except looking into his eyes. Thank you for letting me have this moment with him. Jamal." Alexander stood there. Frozen. The paper trembled between his fingers. His heart, however, had cracked for the first time in years. This simple message had just placed a mirror before him. And in that mirror, he no longer saw the billionaire. He saw the absent father, the one who missed the point. And in the silence of this restaurant suspended in the sky, something shifted. Alexander remained still. His eyes flicked from the plate to his son, then from his son to the plate. A drop of sweat formed on his temple despite the pleasant temperature of the room. He realized, he didn't even know where to begin. How to hold the spoon. How much? Should he warn him first? Encourage him? Should he hold it under his chin to prevent him from choking? All these things he had always left to the professionals. To others. To the people he paid. But that evening, he was alone with Ethan. And facing him, a trusting gaze, a trembling smile, and silent expectation. Alexander felt a mixture of helplessness and shame. He clumsily picked up the fork. His hand was trembling. He tried to stab a piece of fish, but he missed. Then he succeeded, but the piece was too big. He looked at Ethan, who was salivating slightly, his hands clenched on the armrests of the chair. He wanted to eat. He was waiting. But Alexander didn't know how to do it. He looked down, shocked by the brutal reality. He was a man who owned buildings, planes, companies on 3 continents, and he was unable to feed his own son. It was then that a soft, almost whispered voice brought him out of his inner daze. "Mr. Whitmore, if I may." It was Jamal. He wasn't abrupt. He wasn't judging. He wasn't coming to save the day with arrogance. He was coming to help, with that calm kindness that disarms the proud. Alexander nodded slowly, without a word. He was relieved, and ashamed at the same time. Jamal then knelt beside Ethan, like an attentive big brother. He took the time to adjust the napkin around the boy's neck with respectful tenderness, neither too patronizing nor too distant. Then, with sure gestures, he cut the fish into perfectly proportioned bites. "There you go, big guy. We'll do it like usual, eh? Mouth wide open, ah, perfect." He imitated a funny voice, made the sound of a plane landing on a plate, and Ethan burst out into a small, clear laugh. Alexander almost jumped. That laugh. That real laugh. That sonic miracle he hadn't heard since Grace died. Jamal continued. With infinite patience. He gently wiped the corners of Ethan's mouth, praised Ethan with each bite as if he were a little king, slipped in jokes and imitated cartoon character voices. He spoke to Ethan, and only to him. He called him by his first name, described the textures of the food, the smells, as if they were on a sensory journey. Ethan was in heaven. He was floating in a bubble of joy. He was laughing, clapping his hands gently, and swaying with such pure happiness that Alexander felt tears well up in his eyes. The next morning, the Manhattan sky was covered in a gray veil, as if the city itself were holding its breath. But in Alexander Whitmore's heart, another climate was taking hold, that of a new inner turmoil, confused, overwhelming, but alive. He had barely slept. All night, he had thought about that moment. About his son's laughter. About that note left on the table. And above all, about that man, Jamal Brooks, who, without an elite degree, without a prestigious title, without a formal invitation, had been able to see his son as he himself never had. At exactly 11:13, Alexander walked through the restaurant door again. But this time, he wasn't in a suit. He wore a simple shirt, a dark gray coat, and an expression heavier than his past as a real estate titan. "I'm not coming for lunch," he said calmly to the hostess, "that I'm coming to see someone." He waited in a discreet corner. Sitting. Silent. Not on his phone. In no hurry. Present. When Jamal finally emerged from the kitchen, dressed in his impeccable attire but with his sleeves rolled up, his arms still damp from washing up, he stopped dead in his tracks when he saw him. He hadn't expected this. Alexander stood up. And with a rare, almost clumsy gesture, he extended his hand. "Can we talk?" Jamal hesitated for a second, then nodded slowly. They sat in a remote corner of the room at an empty table. Not face to face like two adversaries, but side by side, like two men searching for truth between the lines. Alexander looked at him then. Really? Defenseless. Without a barrier. And with a hoarse voice, weakened by a night of reflection, he murmured. "You changed something in me, Jamal." He took a deep breath. "Yesterday, I saw my son laugh. Not just smile. Laugh. Real laughter. And I realized something awful. I'm afraid of my own son. Afraid of breaking him. Afraid of doing something wrong. Afraid he'll look at me with disappointment. So I hid behind care, behind money. But you weren't afraid." A silence. Painful, but necessary. Jamal looked up then. His gaze wasn't compassionate or accusatory. It was human. I wasn't scared, because I saw it. Then, with disarming gentleness, he added. And he saw me, too. You know, Mr. Whitmore, fear arises when you think you have to control everything. But with kids like Ethan, you just have to be there. Be real. Even awkwardly. And what you did yesterday when you came over, that was already a first step. Alexander bowed his head. For the first time in years, he was letting someone touch his heart. Then he looked up again, determined, like a man ready to change his life. I want you to be more than a waiter or a passerby in my son's life. I want you to be by his side. To accompany him. To be his voice when I don't understand. His mirror. His friend. I want to hire you, Jamal. He took a small black notebook out of his pocket and scribbled a proposal. The amount was more than generous. The role, however, was not that of an employee. It was that of an ally. Jamal read the note. Then he slowly looked up. I will do it, he said, but on one condition. Alexander frowned slightly. Which? That you're there too. Not just at the beginning. Not from afar. Really there. That you learn with me. That you don't delegate love, Mr. Whitmore. Because Ethan isn't looking for a caregiver. He's looking for a father. And you can still become his hero. He's waiting for you to dare. These words hit Alexander like a gentle slap. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then, slowly, he reached out. Not like a boss. Not like a powerful man. But like a father in the making, reaching out to the one who will help him become whole again. Jamal the saw. And in that simple gesture, sealed by an invisible agreement, Ethan's life had changed. Not because two men would now take care of him, but because they would grow up with him. A year later, in that same restaurant perched atop Manhattan's skyline, the tables still sparkled beneath the crystal chandeliers. The service remained impeccable, the tablecloth still white, the silver cutlery still aligned. Nothing had changed, on the surface. But at table 17, the one in the corner, near the large bay windows, the scene was quite different. Where once silence had weighed like an invisible barrier, now bursts of laughter rang out without restraint. We don't treat the invisible. We look at it. We listen to it. And we stay. That day, in the restaurant suspended between heaven and earth, roles had reversed. Silence had given way to joy. Fear had receded. Love had learned to walk, clumsily but surely. And all this. Not because of a board of directors. Not because of a technological miracle. Not because of a conference or a check. Non. It all started with a simple black server. A man who knew how to see the invisible. And who, that evening, had awakened two lives with a single glance. And the loudest, the freest, came from a teenager in a wheelchair. Ethan. He was laughing his head off, his head slightly tilted back, his eyes shining with unfiltered happiness. Before him, a half-empty plate and a father struggling to wield a fork, but applying himself with touching concentration. Alexander Whitmore, the concrete titan, the cold man whom no one dared to contradict just a year ago, was trying, as best he could, to feed his son. He spilled a little sauce, nervously wiped his hands, laughed at his own clumsiness, but every bite, every gesture, was imbued with a sincere, patient, human love. Beside them, comfortably seated, a half-melted ice cream sundae in front of him, Jamal Brooks watched the scene with a quiet smile. He was no longer holding a tray. He was no longer wearing a waiter's uniform. He was part of the family now. You see, Dad, said Ethan with his voice software, one of the big victories of the year, you failed again, but it doesn't matter, you're learning. Alexander burst out laughing. And you're a strict teacher, my friend. They clapped hands like two accomplices. A passing waitress, a new one, obviously, cast a curious glance at this touching scene. she whispered to a colleague. "Who is that gentleman over there?" The older colleague smiled. "Alexander Whitmore." A year ago, he never looked people in the eye. Today, he looks at his son as if he were the eighth wonder of the world. This change wasn't just personal. It had become public. A few months earlier, Alexander had surprised everyone by selling one of his most profitable midtown buildings, a 50-story glass tower, the symbol of his empire. With this money, he launched the Grace Foundation, in tribute to his late wife. A foundation dedicated to inclusive education, supporting children with disabilities, and, above all, training parents so that they are no longer absent in the lives of their children with disabilities. The foundation's motto, engraved on every official document, was simple, powerful, and born from the pen of a former waiter who had become a brother at heart.